And it's my great pleasure to welcome the Reverend Jacynthia Murphy tonight as our presenter. Jacynthia assures me that she's no stranger to anybody, but in case you don't know, she's an Anglican priest living in Tamaki Makaurau. She's of Māori descent. She's working in Tikanga Pākehā in the Diocese of Auckland and living in Helensville. She is part-time the support manager at Tuia General Synod Office. And recently, she attended the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women as one of 10 Anglican Communion delegates. So we're very delighted to welcome you, Jacynthia, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you this evening. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Keridwen, for that wonderful welcome. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā wahine mā I roto I tēnei rorohiko, our virtual presentation this evening, and thank you for the honour of doing so. He Kakano Ahau. I am a seed, born of greatness, descended from a line of chiefs, tūpuna or ancestors who handed down the treasures for abundance so that I too may hand that on to the next generation. Ngā taonga I tuku iho, treasures handed down. He Kakano conveys growth and development and expansion. Even before a seed is planted or nourished, it has inherent promise to take root, emerge, and flourish. A person like a seed is intrinsically linked to generations who have gone and are yet to come. He Kakano derives from somewhere, belongs to something, and cannot be isolated or detached from its whakapapa, its genealogy. In this manner, we are kin with Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth, and Taio, creation. And we are about to accept that our existence is accountable to all forms of life and not to ourselves alone. We must not knowingly cast ourselves above another to claim what is supposed to provide for all. The act of perpetual lessons, wisdom, generosity, and kaitiakitanga or stewardship are to be very much embedded in our collective duty to apologize for any wrong we have done and in the good we have not done. When we accept that we are but one seed in all of God's seabed creation, we are then actively able to better our relationships with each other, with Te Taio, so that the future can be brighter for all. The recent sitting of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, their theme this year was Achieving Gender Equality and Empowerment in the Context of Climate Change. It was following my involvement in the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, or COP15, and the UN COP26, Climate Change, in September-October last year, that I was invited to join with a delegation of women from across the Anglican Communion. Green Anglicans from South Africa, Reverend Rachel Mash. Brazilian Bishop Right Reverend Marinês Rosa dos Santos Basoto. From the Seychelles, Reverend Christine Benoit. Anglican Communion Director for Gender Justice, Mandy Marshall. Shaktan First Nation woman of Canadian descent, Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton. Claygal Nellis, Martha Spence. Florence Yenyonga Ordio, and Anglican representative to the United Nations, Jack Palmer White. In a chorus of joy, our hui kicked off with a jubilant karakia delivered by the effervescent chaplain of the Church Centre for the United Nations, the Reverend Dio Bisiera, who is the first woman of African descent to hold this significant position in the history of the New York Ecumenical and Interfaith Landmark. Her ability to join us in prayerful thanks for the gathering was extremely infectious. Our thanks to our Creator for her gifts. From there, immersing ourselves into various events meant that we heard many very challenging testimonies of those all too familiar stories. The rights to education, the rights to work, the rights to economic independence, full and equal participation at all levels, elimination of all forms of discrimination, condemning violence against women, and bullying, limiting women's agency and reducing their voices. A very perplexing conversation was had about whether we are to accept that wahine are victims today. Going on many of the attitudes, views, and expressions at CSW, it is a bit of a conundrum now, requiring a fuller and deeper conversation. Many refuse to be classified as a victim and/or survivor, preferring to rightfully place the emphasis on the act or the perpetration upon another, rather than always being the victim. To say that women around the globe are being victimized, well, that had more certainty. And we are still experiencing this act against women all around the globe. This conversation made evident the strength and confidence of women in a pandemic-ravaged world of 2022. Papatuanuku, Mother Earth, has stirred a strong call that now is the time for us to shift our focus onto the victimization placed upon her by us all. Women are seeking transformation based on values of nature and nurture and those things that are life-giving, not economics, prize-giving. We are becoming more confident as advocates for Papatuanuku, and our message is that economics mustn't trump all other forms of wellness. Women in CSW are acutely aware that our wairua, our spirit, has become slave to economics. And without the balance of cultural, environmental, and social well-beings also, we are causing great spiritual harm to ourselves and to many. The laments of the Indigenous women over spiritual harm was deafening. An area of great passion was the stand for land property rights discussion. In South America and India, only men can inherit land. Often, once they do, they borrow against it and run away. Women are then landless and unable to procure food. Despite being the major cultivators, they still can't own land. Medicinal planting, or rongoa as we know it here in Aotearoa, is not recognised as viable or economic. Whenua means everything to Māori and Indigenous peoples. It provides long-term, sustainable waiora health for the whole whānau, for the marae, and for our communities. When shadowed by economics, which Indigenous peoples often do not have, does it affect their mana? Yes, it does. Does it cause spiritual harm? Yes, it does. The inability to live a sustainable lifestyle in the manner in which they are traditionally accustomed to is grossly damaging the social, cultural, and environmental fabric of the whenua and Indigenous peoples. It is these losses that fills our jails, our hospitals, and our urupa cemeteries. Gender equity and workplace bullying featured high on my interest list. The most perplexing aspect of workplace bullying is that many of us don't actually recognise it. There's the usually well-known aspects of bullying, and there's the less than obvious acts that we might even dismiss or think, oh, I'm probably just being a bit thin-skinned. Or I need to toughen up a bit. Or worse still, being told that by another. All acts of bullying will affect a person's ability to work effectively. Women are more susceptible to being bullied in the workplace. The forum looked at the impact of minor and serious bullying at a more microscopic level. It included intimidation, insults, threats, the dismissing of efforts, having credit taken for their work, excessive monitoring, being ignored, given less work to do, and squeezed out of workloads so that their value is measured as less than is required. Workplace bullying. And when a woman dares to challenge the status quo, structures or policies of domination and exploitation that undermines women, what in God's name might those consequences be? Climate and gender justice in the Catholic Church unravelled decades of hurt and inequality. The spotlight was on the ordination of women and quest for synodical change. It took interesting turns when it came to the worth and the value of women in the hāhi. I heard anthropocentrism, eco-womanism, ecofeminism, and Shakti, to name a few. Grandmother ecology and mother environmentology kept us on track with Papa Tuanuku and our inherent right to protect her. Tell the men to put into action what matches their words, they said. Women are the social investment or social investors of the future. These wahine definitely know their value and believe that an equitable church will be a healthy church, improving its ability to care for Mother Earth. Our sisters from the Pacific were powerfully prepared and delivered what some might consider uncomfortable truths. In their event, Women of the Pacific, Policies and Practical Realities. They confronted the all-important issues of fair workplace rights, fair elections, collaborative voices to get the state to acknowledge women more, Pacific feminism, the need for more women in power, and that women are committed in the Pacific to stopping corruption. A particularly poignant moment was addressing the matter of violence is not a female issue. It is a male problem. Men are the reason we are facing this heinous crime against women. Until the male population in the Pacific own up and curb their propensity to violate women in this way, it will continue to plague society and women in particular long into the future. With women in power, it was thought that new strategies be developed and monitored with much more severe consequences for offenders and perpetrators. Attempts to lasso the fairly won recent election was considered a gross violation against women. Mandy Marshall, the Director of Gender Justice for the Anglican Communion, said that when disasters do strike, the situation can be made worse for women and girls as their vulnerability increases in many ways. This might come from their limited access to safe sanitation, water, and shelter, but also from increased exposure to abuse and sexual violence. Mandy said churches are a vital voice in the conversation around climate change. They are often the first to respond in a time of crisis, as they are at the centre of the community and are trusted by local communities. She said the Anglican Communion delegation to CSW aimed to ensure that Anglicans and all people of faith are included in the response to gender, climate change, and disaster response and mitigation. As women of faith here in Aotearoa and Pacifica, let us join in that chorus of hope that, like Papa Tuanuku, is a seed that will continue to flourish forevermore. We are to encourage all women of faith to become community leaders in eco-justice, working to protect Mother Earth. We are to poke at the structures that restrict women from being at the decision-making tables at all levels of the church. We are to ensure that the motions we passed at previous synods are honoured and actioned, rather than simply being words on paper, or, in the words of young Greta Thunberg, blah, blah, blah. In closing, our ecumenical faith-based sessions, many questions to arouse our inner seeds were asked. We are blessed with the precious gift of life. It is our fundamental duty to bestow that same gift upon the many parts of creation we equally share and enjoy. It will be in that shared blessing that we all join in planting, taking root, emerging, and flourishing. Dear friends and colleagues, e te whānau a te karaiti. In aspiring to do what I know is not enough, and be willing to go beyond what I know is not enough, as a Christian and fellow living seed in God's creation, I commit myself and all that I am and do to doing better. May I offer my sincere thanks for the blessing of being one small voice in the ambitious transformation of a global stance on climate impacts, planetary crises, and the status of women. He Kakano Ahau, tātou mā. Nō reira, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you. Kia ora, Keridin. I hand it over to you now.
I was just taking some deep breaths, Jacynthia, and I think we all need time for a few deep breaths and time to reflect. So in a couple of minutes, when you're ready, you might like to unmute yourself if you want to say something. You're welcome to just say it, but there's quite a lot of people on, so it might be a good idea also just to put up a hand so that I can make sure that people get included. So just when you're ready.
Keridwen, I'm happy to take any questions from anybody if they're wanting to know a little bit more about. There were 23 sessions that I attended in total. I've only touched on, 3 or 4 really. It's been my focus this evening. But there were many, and you would have seen in the slides that we're rotating at a regular pace. They were some of the others that I attended as well. So there were many, the voices of Asia Pacific, the voices of India, the voices of America, the voices of Canada, and the list goes on and on. But in the 20-minute brief, I'm unable to cover them all.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Jacynthia. I was very struck by all the faces, all the different faces that you kept on bringing into our rooms. It was great. And I was also struck by how what you said wove so beautifully with 2 of our previous speakers, Emily Colgan and Sylvia Purdy. And I can see Sylvia's here and would like to speak. So welcome, Sylvia.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa. And mihi atukia koe, Jacynthia. Thank you so much for your beautiful work. You've stunned us all into silence, obviously. Just this kind of, you just kind of laid out one after the other, all this kind of sort of massive realities and I guess I feel my privilege, and I also feel my own vulnerability as well as a woman. I've did some work a couple of years ago about bullying and gendered bullying in the church. I was pretty shocked to actually experience that for myself and the effects that had on me. And I'm a pretty, well articulate, well-educated, privileged, Pākehā, wealthy woman, and it still really shook me to my core to experience that. So I can just I just want to honor the importance of that connecting that you've done with women from around the world, and even just in virtual formats. It's almost a little saddens my heart in a way to see all the faces on the screen, because it's so much more powerful to be there in person, isn't it? So my question, if I had a question, would be, tell us a bit more about those relationships and how that was for you, being in those communities of people. Were you able to do some face-to-face, or has it all been just online, and what next for you with all of that?
Kia ora, thank you, Sylvia. I was virtual, so I wasn't in
at all.
Which is fine. I mean, it made it easier for me to say yes. Yes, I'll participate. And I would say, probably 85% of the participants were virtual. I did have many opportunities in those 23 sessions that I attended. And just to give you some idea of the scale of things, there were roughly about 800 events. Many of them ran at the same time in New York and other places, not just in New York. But of course, we have to sleep, we have to rest, we have to do all those things, which makes it impossible for us. Most of those sessions were at 1 a.m., 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. for me here in Aotearoa. So doing my hair at 3 a.m. in the morning and putting on a bit of lippy is a bit of a chore, let's say. But seriously, I did have many opportunities to meet, let's say, face-to-face in breakout rooms. And it was in the times in the breakout rooms. So one session, for instance, had 480 participants. That's probably one of the biggest sessions I was involved with. And so there were 60 or something breakout rooms. And we were allowed a good, 20 minutes to be in those rooms, but that's not always enough. And by and large, I just listened. Really, I didn't participate in any particular way, and just to hear them, I think it's probably, some of it was a reality shock for me. The biggest one was land rights. I had no idea that people experience that, and the depth of that. So being able to talk about the impacts of property rights and loss of land really resonated for me. But to hear it from our Native American Indians, to hear it from our Canadian, the Inupiat, the Indians, the Brazilians, to hear their story about land loss, whilst they're similar, many of their stories are actually much more violent, much more, what can I say? You know, like the rich are buying up pockets of rivers, so they've got big yachts parked in all these rivers, and so it becomes private property. And so the indigenous peoples who would normally get in their canoes to fish the river are no longer permitted to do so. That is really harmful, really, really harmful. So it becomes about property ownership, who owns the land, as to whether you can survive on it. Now, many of those indigenous peoples in South America are unable to care for themselves. So they're actually starving. You know, so it's those powerful interactions with different people on what's the Pacific, for instance, that really, I resonated with that, the women of the Pacific, young and old. Asia was another area where they're experiencing a lot of women being an inconsequence to any decision making. If you ever watch any of the United Nations stuff on television, you'll see that when they take photos, any United Nations things, when they take photos, you usually see that on the news, you might get one woman in a lineup of 50. That's reality. That's real at the United Nations level. And so it's hearing about how do we actively, you know, bring about change and transformation.